eschatology happening in the church. And I was sharing with someone last night when I showed you Kevin Connor's picture. Kevin was the academic dean for a very large congregation in Portland, Oregon. And its name was, at the time, Bible Temple. And Kevin was brought there to head up their Bible college. And it was the Portland Bible College, and they sent out and raised up all kinds of pastors like the church in Anchorage, Alaska that I was a part of. Bible Temple in Anchorage, Alaska, and the church in Anchorage, Alaska, Dick Benjamin and the pastor of Bible Temple was Dick Iverson. They both were cut out of the same cloth, had similar backgrounds, and were both Pentecostal charismatic churches, independent, and not aligned with any charismatic denomination or Pentecostal denomination. But they were good friends, and they always had a conference in Portland, Oregon, as well as Anchorage, Alaska, with all the different networks of churches. And so Kevin Connor raised up and wrote a lot of his books, too, while he was the academic dean in Portland, Oregon. And that's why I was able to see him before he moved back to Australia and began pastoring a church over there. So Kevin would always teach this, what he believed, and wrote the books that he believed. And the pastor, Dick Iverson, was fully okay with that. But the position of the pastor was, here are the three main beliefs, approaches to eschatology, and then they would teach all three, and then they say, you just pick one. You know, whatever lines up with you. But Kevin, of course, being post-trib, he taught what he taught. And I love the fact that Dick Iverson allowed him to have the expression of his own views, because he was such a celebrated theologian and author and a prolific writer. So the thing that I do want to say, which I failed to say last night and I plan to, is that I just want to throw out this disclaimer that New Song does not, I am not the official representation of what New Song believes on eschatology. Yet Jeff, in his grace, has allowed me to share this room with you this morning and use this platform to share what is my humble opinion and my best understanding, and I want to emphasize that. This is my best understanding after decades of studying this, 48 years of studying end times, and it's always subject to change when the real deal shows up, right? Because Kevin says, and he wrote the foreword for my Countdown to Eternity, he also loved my novel. And he said, basically, he says, Jay has something to really share and well worth reading, well worth considering. However, and this is what he always said about his own writings, however, only history proves prophecy. So we can't be dogmatic about whatever our position is. We can't be dogmatic like this is the gospel, and if you do not believe what I believe on end times, then, anathema. I just disfellowship you. And that's kind of the way some people approach eschatology, at least those that have very strong beliefs, very strong convictions. Because like when I first found out there was another way of looking at the end times besides pre-trib, I was blown away. I mean, I thought everybody believed that. And today, most everybody believes and embraces the pre-trib teaching. Most charismatic churches, most evangelicals, most Pentecostal churches, most of the prophets in that vein right now embrace also dominion theology, which is to believe that we must be active, extremely active in government, make sure the United States continues to be the light of the world so that we can get all the rest of the world ready for Jesus to come back, Christianize as many nations as possible so that he can come and then set up his government and finish the job of Christianizing the rest of the nations. Well, that's just not what the Revelation teaches. It's not what Paul taught, and it's not what Jesus taught. It is a view, it's a perspective, but it's not what the Bible really says from my viewpoint because I've been studying this for so long and through the Bible over and over again, reading it through every year. And I keep coming back to what I'm teaching to you because I want to make the plain, the main sense, or what I see as the plain sense and what makes sense, the literal sense of it, and not try to read anything into it. Revelation is full of symbolism, but there is a rhyme and reason to it because we are not, John is not addressing the details of how things unfold. For example, right now, if we just do nothing but watch conservative talk or listen to conservative talk radio or watch conservative news or what have you, or watch, the other news. If we only look at that and see what's going on in the world today, we could get very disheartened. We can't spend all of our time looking at what's going on around us, and we can't try to fit that into eschatology and figure out what's going on. And I want to share this with you too, is that the voices, the prophetic voices today out there are persuaded by their eschatology, or let me say influenced by their eschatology. And if their eschatology is dominion theology, and I just encourage you to look it up, Google it, look at all that's written about dominion theology. But if you take a look at that, you can understand why the church had been divided over this very thing. The very election process, the very thing that, we're prophesying that there's going to be a second term for our president. And it never happened. And so a lot of people got disillusioned and there was a lot of conflict going on. And this is also part of the scheme of the enemy. His plan is to divide and conquer. And so is the plan of secular humanism, that is the foundation for socialism, which is the foundation for communism, which is the foundation for globalism, which is the foundation building up to the New World Order, which we will be talking about today. So we have to have a good, solid foundation of what is the Bible teaching and have somewhat of an understanding, not trying to get into the weeds of everything. All the years I've been teaching eschatology, I didn't get into the weeds. Because every kind of book that came out on eschatology from the other schools of interpretation would begin to read into the current events. Well, this is what is happening now, therefore. And it's just not quite that simple. I've been pastoring 40 years, I've pastored 3 churches since 1976, January. And it was invariably, depending on what the geopolitical conditions of and events of the day were happening, something would come out in a book on eschatology. Let's go back to where they were saying this is going to happen. I remember I was pastoring in Florida, and a prophet had prophesied an earthquake, and it happened. It was the Monaga earthquake. And so she prophesied again that all the state of Florida was going to be 2 feet underwater from a tidal wave. And there were other people that were believing that because she was right. And I had to tell my congregation, hey, this is not going to happen. It's not in the end time teaching, for one thing. I mean, it is, but it's not going to happen because this woman who has prophesied and got one thing accurate doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to be accurate on everything going forward, because the Bible says we know in part and we prophesy in part. So we're not, perfect creatures in that sense. We still have a lot of things that we don't know, that we can categorize under what the Bible terms as the mysteries of God. And God just isn't going to let us know everything, but He can give us the schematics of what's coming down the pike, and we just are where we are right now, seeing that everything that's going on around us is all just the precursor to building up to what you're going to see me teach you this morning in the book of Revelation. So I want you to realize that don't get so into what the prophets are saying. Don't get so into, we can take them into consideration, and we are to judge all things and prove what is good. Take away, we chew the meat and spit out the bones, right? But I stand before you as a person who gives you my best understanding. I'm not going to be dogmatic about this, but I am dogmatic about one thing. Jesus is coming back. And it's nearer than when we first believed. If it's in my lifetime, then I want to be ready for it. But at least if it's not in my lifetime, I want to prepare the next generation for it, because it could be that generation. We are in the last days, because we're in that between the beginning of the kingdom being initiated and the consummation, full consummation of the kingdom at the second coming of Jesus. So I just got on my platform a little bit there. So, okay, let's go to Revelation 6 on the pages that I handed out to you. And if you were given, Don, did you get the pages, the Revelation? No, that's going to be, let me get this for you. You got it? Yes, that's what you need. Thank you. Okay, so just a quick review. Chapter 1, we saw Jesus presented to us. It is the unveiling of Jesus Christ. That's what all of the book of Revelation is revealing to us at different angles of how he's going to be presenting himself in the last days, particularly in the book of Revelation. So chapter 1 opens the door. We're the blessed people if we read it and hear it and take it to heart. And so that's what we're all doing. That's what you're doing. He stood as the high priest examining the 7 lampstands that he was standing in the midst of. And so then, chapters 2 and 3, we dealt with what he was having an issue with in those churches. And then we went from there to talk about how these also have an overlaying, prophetic, symbolic layout towards the future. So Ephesus was the apostolic era from AD 34 to 100. That's what that would represent, the early church. Then we have Smyrna, which has to do with bitter. And all of this I have in this book here. Actually not, in your notes, in the Revelation notes. That's one reason I gave you my Revelation notes, is that I cover all of the book of Revelation in those. That's my college notes that I gave you. All right, Pergamos is the empirical church era. Then we had Thyatira, the Roman papal era, which really almost spans just about 1,000 years, was referred to as the Dark Ages, and I gave you some charts to take a look at to see how across the church age history things have unfolded towards today. Then we had Sardis, was the Reformation era that began with Martin Luther, bringing back salvation by faith through grace and not by works. Okay, then we had the Philadelphia missionary era, the Philadelphia church, representing that from 1750 to 1850. And now we are in the era from 1850 to today, which is the democratic church era. And Laodicea happens to be a reference to that which is mob rule. And there's so much more about that. I love teaching the Revelation, and because this isn't a Bible college class, I can't go into the details. I'm going, I wish I could tell you more. Okay, so interesting that this is a reference to mob rule, and given what we've been seeing more and more, it always has to do with the handful of people that will stir up the oligarchs and the handful of those in political power that can stir up the masses and create mob rule, create chaos, so that they can then operate behind the scenes to do what they want to do. Now, so with summary of the time element here that we're looking at in Revelation 1 through 3, we see Christ as the high priest. Revelation chapter 4, 5, and 6, we see Christ as the Lamb and our Redeemer. He's the only one that could open those 7 seals on that rolled up scroll that was written on both sides. Now, we started last night, and we're picking up today. So if you didn't get a chance to be here last night, we have video recorded this, and you can catch up with that later. But really, we're basically just now getting started with all the good stuff. And Jesus talked about, as the birth pangs of a woman, things would get faster and faster towards the end of the age. And we're starting out with the 7 seals. So for those of you who have ever given birth, the labor pains and the whatever you call it gets closer and closer until the birth happens. What do you call it? Yes. Okay. Birth pains, contractions. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Anna. But it's like it's going to start out slow. The revelation starts out slow with the seals. There's 7 seals. And out of each, the 7th seal, out of the 7 seals is going to come the 7 trumpets. And out of the 7th trumpet then is going to come the 7 bowls of wrath. So again, as I shared last night, the number 7 is the number of perfection and completion. And because Revelation is about the end of all age, it's about the full completing of everything coming to a close. So, but we're in seals right now, and it's really slow because it's extending from the early church, starting with the white horse, the conquering gospel going forth, not the Antichrist, as others teach. I believe that hermeneutically, the most sound look at this is that this is about Jesus going forth with the conquering gospel, conquering men's hearts. Now, the next one that we're going to look at is the red horse. And I'm not going to take a whole lot of time on some of these because I'm trying to get to the full picture. Remember, I'm flying 30,000 feet and not down in the weeds, but I will on some issues. But what we have here, if you're looking at your Revelation Bible pages that I handed out, when he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come and see." And another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. So this is a red horse. Red always has to do with bloodshed. And we have this representing worldwide wars and bloodshed. Now remember, Jesus, when he was talking to his disciples in Matthew, and they were asking about the temple and all these beautiful buildings, and he talked about not one stone, all these beautiful buildings, they're all going to be torn down. That happened a generation later, and it really more or less kicked off this worldwide wars and bloodshed, because in 70 AD, there were over 1 million Jews that were killed, slaughtered, and hung on crosses. Hung on crosses. A great Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, wrote about the details of that. And it was just a horrific time. And Jesus said, when you see the army surrounding the city, get out of here. If you're pregnant, pray that you're not pregnant, or pray it's not on the Sabbath, but you have to get out. And because the Christian community took that to heart and they believed the words of Jesus, they got out of there. So there were no Christians that were killed, no Christians that were slaughtered. They fled to the mountains. They went and hid in the caves and so on and so forth. But this now clicks off the war, the bloodshed that's happening, because Jesus said to his disciples, you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars, and nation shall rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And is that not what we've continued to see ever since? Of course, again, it is humanity happening, driven by the sin nature of greed and power. The third one here is the black horse. So when he opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarii, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarii, and do not harm the oil and the wine." So this is representative of worldwide famine and scarcity of food, which has happened in many various nations and so on and so forth. I mean, even we've experienced that in the history of the United States at times. So what's going on, again, is that as each seal is open, it's going to continue on all the way through to the second coming. It stays open, it gradually intensifies until it fully consummates at the second coming. The time will come when the white horse conquering gospel going forth will cease, because God's wrapping it all up. There'll come a time when the red horse, worldwide wars and bloodshed, will cease at the Battle of Armageddon. That will be the biggest, most culminating war of Jesus at the Battle of Armageddon and wiping out all those who have risen up against him. Third, the black horse, famine and scarcity of food. That's going to intensify and consummate, as we will see once the trumpets start opening up. And it's going to be a significant time, but again, it keeps intensifying. And once a seal is open, it remains open. Now, verse 7, when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. Now, I want to point one thing out. When you have war between nations, property is devastated. Crops are devastated. They just go in and just destroy everything. And so they don't have anything left over, and to recover from that, it's going to take a while. So it triggers war. War always triggers famine. So the nations that reject the gospel, the nations that reject God wanting to be, rule over their kingdom, which he is anyway, whether they know it or not. But when you reject the gospel, war is going to happen. And when war happens, the byproduct of that is famine. And so there's been a constant rejection of the gospel in nations and being kicked out. And you look at these nations, they're not doing too well. The reason why the United States has been so blessed and so prosperous is because it was founded on embracing God as their divine ruler, in the sense. Looking to Jesus as Lord and Savior. Acknowledging that God is the one that gives us these rights, not the government. So when we start turning away from God, it's a rejection of the gospel, it's a rejection of the conquering king, and the byproduct of that is going to be obvious. It just takes a little time to get there, but it inevitably gets there. Now, we have the fourth one that I just started reading, and there are in this two factors, death and Hades. And there is 4 instruments of death: the sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts. Now, here's where I want to share with you why the pandemic of COVID is part of what we've experienced. I'm not going to try to get into the detail of how COVID came about. God knows. But what's relevant is a lot of people began to panic. Is this worldwide pandemic that is hitting every nation, is this the end times? And I say yes, but no. We're not completely there yet. It's not the first time the world has been hit with worldwide famine and plague. There's been a lot of plagues that have destroyed so many people's lives, and you can do a history lesson on that. But I'm not here to tell you about that. I'm just saying it's all part of the increasing and intensifying of this fourth seal, the pale horse, that's going to have pestilence, plagues, and death. The sword also is part of that reference to people being killed. We've seen a lot happen. If you've been around as long as I have, even just the last 30 years, we've seen a lot. The rise, just the 9/11 that happened, all that's going on over in the Middle East, and all the Christians that were being martyred and killed. This is now under the fifth seal. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Now, I'm just throwing a little tidbit out here. There are those who believe that when you die, you go into a sleep death, a conscious sleep death, and you won't be conscious of where you are until Jesus comes back and your body is resurrected. But this kind of throws water on that, because we find here souls that have been slain, and they're crying out to God, how long before you avenge our death? So they are in heaven, but they're seeing and recognizing there needs to be some justice here. We have all been designed by God to appreciate and value and want to see justice, want to see inequity dealt with. Why do we go to movies that have a plot of a hero and a heroine and a bad guy that wants to take over the world? I mean, it's always the same plot. It's just, rearranged with different characters and different subsettings. But at the end of the movie, if it doesn't end up with justice and the hero wins, the good guy wins and the bad guy loses, it's kind of a bummer. Right? Because we're wired to want to see good win out over evil. And God will always win out over evil. This isn't a battle between good and evil. God has already won over evil through the cross. But what is happening here is they're crying out for God to avenge their blood. And so a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them, they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed. See, God in his omniscience and his omnipotence and omnipresence, he knows what's going to happen tomorrow and the next day and 1,000 years out. He already knows. It's like today going on with him. The past, present, and future is all happening right here before him, and there's nothing he doesn't know. So he knows how many will be killed. He knows how many will be martyred for their faith. And he says there's a time where that will end, that will be completed. And it's going to happen in the events of the Revelation. And it's going to happen by the time Jesus comes back. That will all be done. There will be no more martyrs of the faith after Jesus comes back. We'll talk more about that later. Now, I brought my book here, wanting to read this to you. And the intensification of martyrdom, obviously in the first 300 years, Christians were being martyred as sport, as blood sport. The Colosseums and the gladiators, and they're taken out into the Colosseums for lions to kill them. Even Paul himself was martyred. He was beheaded for his faith. All the disciples were all martyred for their faith, with the exception of John, who just died a natural death. But I want to tell you about a website. When I wrote this book, it came out in 2015, and things were a little bit different there, but the overall premise of everything is still holding true. And there's one organization called the Voice of the Martyrs. Anybody ever hear of that, the Voice of the Martyrs? And you can just keep track and keep up with them. They will show you how many people are being killed for their faith. We're pretty blessed in America. That's not happening to us. Not saying that won't come someday or has the potential to come around someday, but we're blessed to live in a country that still has the freedom of religion, right? But you go to other parts of the world and you say, do you believe you're going to be living in tribulation? You're going to be raptured out before the great tribulation? I've traveled the world, many mission locations. I've been all over the world, and I would always ask this question: are you going to go through great tribulation? And they look at me and say, "What are you talking about? We are in tribulation. We live in tribulation." And it's a Western popular teaching. We don't want to go through anything like that. And we can find the scriptures that will kind of, out of context, tell us we won't suffer God's wrath during that time. No, we won't suffer God's wrath because Jesus Christ saved us. We will suffer if we're around and be part of the collateral damage because of what's coming on the earth. So I read this from OpenDoorsUSA.org. At that time, this is what they said. Each month, 322 Christians are killed for their faith. Each month. Each month, 214 Christian churches and properties are destroyed. And each month, 772 forms of violence are committed against Christians, such as beatings, abductions, rapes, arrests, and forced marriages. I once watched a video that was called about sheep among wolves, and it was about Christians who are living in the Islamic countries. And they live day by day wondering if it's their last day to be alive, if they're found out that they are Christians, if it's their last day, or this is the day that one of the daughters is going to get raped. And one girl, her testimony was that when she was being raped, she said this to the Lord. She prayed to the Lord as she was being raped. Lord Jesus, I commit my body to you as a living sacrifice. That was her mindset. She wasn't seeing herself as a victim. She was recognizing that in this life, this is not what we're looking toward. We live in a fallen world, and we live in a place where there's a potential for the most horrific things to happen to us. And we will not be alone, because if you ever get hold of the book of the Fox's Book of Martyrs, it's just an incredible, amazing read. I read it for a reality check so that I can be thankful for what I have, but also know that if ever came a time and place where I had to live by my conviction and face, like Daniel, the 3 men in Daniel that were thrown into the fire, or Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. They stood for conviction and they did not yield, even if it meant death. And so martyrdom is going to be, and is right now in this world, and this seal has been opened, and we are in this 5th seal. Only it's going to intensify until, under the rule and reign of the Antichrist, he will be killing Christians all over the world.